You move through your days carrying more than you realize. Not in your hands, not in your schedule, but inside your mind. Small moments press against you, shaping your mood in ways that feel almost invisible. A single comment lingers longer than it should. A slight delay becomes irritation. Someone's tone shifts, and suddenly your calm disappears. It all happens so quietly that you rarely stop to question it. At some point, this becomes your normal. You start to believe that this is just how life works, that your inner state will always depend on what happens around you. That peace is something fragile, something that can be taken away by the smallest disturbance. But if you look closely, something doesn't add up, because it's not the event itself that takes your peace. It's what happens inside you after the event. And that part, the part you've been overlooking, is where everything begins to change. There is a moment, so brief that it almost disappears, between what happens and how you respond. Most people never notice it. They move too fast. The reaction comes instantly, and it feels like there was never a choice. But that's not true. The choice was there. It just passed by unnoticed. And when something goes unnoticed long enough, it starts to feel automatic. You react, and only later do you reflect. You speak, and only later do you realize what you meant to say. You feel something intensely, and only afterward do you question why it affected you so much. That delay creates a quiet kind of regret, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. It builds over time. It chips away at your clarity, your confidence, your sense of control. But the moment you slow down even slightly, something shifts. You begin to notice that space. It's small at first, barely noticeable, but it's there, and in that space something powerful begins to emerge. Awareness. Instead of being pulled immediately into reaction, you start to see it forming. You feel the urge rise, the tension builds, the impulse pushes forward. But instead of following it blindly, you pause, and in that pause you are no longer trapped inside the reaction. You are watching it. That distance changes everything, because once you can observe something, you are no longer controlled by it. You don't have to suppress what you feel. You don't have to pretend it isn't there. You simply choose what to do with it, quietly, deliberately, and for the first time your response becomes yours, not automatic, not borrowed from habit, not dictated by the moment. Chosen. That realization begins to spread into every part of your life. You start to see how often you've been reacting without thinking, how many decisions were made under pressure without clarity, how many emotions were accepted without question. And slowly those patterns begin to loosen. The reaction that once felt like a command starts to feel like a suggestion, something you can follow or something you can ignore. But even as you begin to master that pause, something deeper still operates beneath the surface. Because what affects you most is not what happens. It's what you believe it means. Someone doesn't reply, and your mind calls it rejection. A plan fails, and it becomes proof that you're not capable. A mistake happens, and suddenly it feels personal. But if we look closely, the event itself is simple. Neutral even. It's the meaning you attach to it that gives it weight. And that meaning forms instantly. So fast that it feels like reality, but it isn't. It's a story your mind creates and then believes without question. And once you begin to see that clearly, something powerful returns to you. The ability to question it. You don't have to accept every thought as truth. You don't have to believe every interpretation your mind offers. You can pause again, this time not between event and reaction, but between event and meaning. You can ask yourself quietly whether what you're feeling is coming from what actually happened or from what you decided it meant. And that question creates space. Space for a different perspective. Space for a lighter interpretation. Space for something that doesn't pull you down. Maybe that silence wasn't rejection. Maybe it was distraction. Maybe that failure wasn't a reflection of your ability. Maybe it was timing. Maybe it was circumstance. When you allow for more than one interpretation, the emotional weight begins to shift. Things feel less personal. less heavy, less overwhelming. And with that, your stability deepens. You stop tying your identity to every outcome. You stop measuring yourself by every result. You begin to stand on something more solid, something that doesn't change with every moment. But there's another layer, one that works even more quietly. It's not in what happens. It's not even in what you think. It's in what surrounds you. The energy of people, the tone of conversations, the atmosphere of environments. You walk into certain places and feel calm without knowing why. You leave others feeling drained, even when nothing obvious went wrong. That's not snot slock skirmos. And influence, when repeated often enough, becomes part of you. You absorb more than you notice. You carry more than you choose. And over time, it shapes how you think, how you feel, how you respond. If you spend enough time around negativity, it begins to echo inside you. Not because you agreed with it, but because you allowed it to stay. And once you see that clearly, you begin to choose more carefully, not with resistance, not with fear, but with intention. You start to notice which conversations leave you grounded and which ones leave you unsettled, which people bring clarity and which ones bring confusion. And slowly, your boundaries begin to form. Not walls, but filters. You don't have to avoid everything. You don't have to isolate yourself. You simply become selective. You choose what you engage with. You step back from what consistently drains you. You protect your mental space the same way you would protect anything valuable. Because it is valuable. And the more intentional you become, the more stable you feel. Not because the world has changed, but because you have. But even then, something follows you everywhere. It doesn't come from people. It doesn't come from situations. It comes from you, your expectations, the quiet assumptions you carry into every moment without realizing it, that things should go a certain way, that people should behave fairly. That effort should always lead to results. And when reality doesn't match those expectations, tension appears. Not because something is wrong, but because something didn't go the way you imagined. That gap between expectation and reality is where most frustration lives, and the more rigid those expectations are, the wider that gap becomes. But when you begin to loosen them, something changes. You stop demanding that life follows your script. You start allowing it to unfold, not passively, not without effort, but without resistance to what you cannot control. And with that, flexibility begins to replace frustration. You adapt faster, you recover quicker, you move forward without carrying unnecessary weight, not because everything is going right, but because you're no longer insisting that it must. Still, there are moments when emotion rises strongly. Anger, frustration, resentment. It builds quickly, and in those moments, awareness feels distant again. Most people respond in one of two ways. They either release it immediately, often causing damage, or they suppress it, letting it build quietly inside. But both lead to the same place: loss of control. What changes everything is not getting rid of those emotions, but understanding them. Because they are not the problem. They are energy, raw, intense, and powerful. And like any form of energy, they can either destroy or be directed. When you stop seeing emotion as something to eliminate and start seeing it as something to guide, your relationship with it changes completely. That anger can become focus. That frustration can become discipline. That intensity can become momentum. But only if you don't let it take over. Only if you remain aware enough to choose where it goes. And as you continue to build that awareness, something else becomes clear. Your mind doesn't just react to the present, it leaves it. It drifts into the future, into possibilities that haven't happened, into problems that don't exist yet, and somehow your body responds as if they're real. Tension rises, stress builds, focus disappears. You find yourself dealing with something that isn't even happening. That's where anxiety lives, not in reality, but in imagination. And the way out is not through more thinking, it's through returning back to what is actually here. Your breath, your surroundings, this moment, because in this exact second, most of the time, there is no real threat, only a projection. And the more you anchor yourself in what is real, the less power those projections have. You stop fighting things that don't exist. You start dealing with what does. And underneath all of this there is one final layer, the need for approval, the way your mood rises when you are praised and falls when you are criticized. It feels natural, almost unavoidable. But it creates instability, because if your state depends on how others see you, then it is never fully yours. It is always being adjusted, constantly. And once you see that clearly, you begin to shift your focus. You stop measuring yourself by reactions. You start measuring yourself by actions, your discipline, your consistency, your integrity, things that are within your control. And when those become your standard, something settles inside you. Praise becomes optional. Criticism loses its weight. Your state becomes steady, not because the world is quiet, but because you are no longer relying on it for stability. And as all of this comes together, your perspective begins to widen. What once felt urgent starts to feel temporary. What once felt overwhelming starts to feel manageable. You begin to see how quickly most things pass. What feels heavy today fades tomorrow. What feels important now becomes irrelevant later. And when you truly understand that, something shifts. You stop reacting to everything. You start choosing. Choosing what deserves your attention. Choosing what deserves your energy. Choosing what deserves your response. You stop giving permanent reactions to temporary situations, and that is where real control begins. Not in controlling the world, but in understanding yourself. And if you keep going, if you keep noticing that space, that pause, that awareness, something even deeper begins to unfold. Because even after you learn to pause, even after you question your thoughts, even after you shape your environment, there is still something within you that continues quietly, shaping everything without asking. And unless you see it clearly, it will keep pulling you back into the same patterns. It shows up in the way you talk to yourself when no one else is around. Not in loud, obvious ways, but in quiet, subtle sentences that pass through your mind without resistance. A small mistake happens and there's a whisper that says, "You always do this." Something doesn't go your way, and another voice adds, "This is just who you are." You don't stop to question it. You don't examine where it came from. You just accept it because it sounds familiar. But familiarity is not truth. Those inner sentences, repeated often enough, begin to shape how you see yourself. And once they take hold, they don't just stay as thoughts. They become filters. Everything you experience starts passing through them. If you believe you're not capable, every challenge feels like confirmation. If you believe people don't respect you, every interaction feels slightly off. If you believe things never work out for you, even small setbacks feel like proof. And without realizing it, you begin to live inside a version of reality that your own mind created. This is where most people get stuck. Not because life is against them, but because their interpretation of themselves quietly limits what they see, what they try, and what they expect. But the moment you become aware of that voice, something changes. You start to hear it instead of being it. You notice the pattern instead of automatically believing it. And once again that space appears, the space between the thought and your acceptance of it. You don't need to fight the thought. You don't need to silence it. You simply stop agreeing with it blindly. You question it. Is this actually true? Or is this just something I've repeated so many times that it feels true? And when you ask that question honestly, many of those thoughts begin to lose their weight. They don't disappear immediately. They still show up, but they don't land the same way. They don't define you the way they used to, because now you are aware, and awareness weakens what used to control you. This is where a different kind of strength begins to form. Not loud, not aggressive, but steady. You stop building your identity on passing moments. You stop letting temporary failures define permanent beliefs. Instead, you begin to see yourself as something more stable, something that exists beyond each success and each mistake, and with that, your actions begin to change. You take risks you would have avoided before. You speak when you would have stayed quiet. You try again, even when something didn't work the first time, not because you suddenly became fearless, but because you stopped letting fear decide who you are. And as this shift continues, your relationship with time begins to change as well. Before, everything felt immediate, urgent, like every moment required a reaction. But now, you start to see the long view. You begin to understand that most things are not as important as they feel in the moment. That what seems like a major setback today might not even matter a month from now. And that realization creates patience. You don't rush into reactions as quickly. You don't attach yourself to every outcome. You allow things to unfold without needing instant resolution. They don't chase. They set. Most people never develop. Because while others are reacting quickly, you're observing clearly. While others are pulled into every emotional wave, you're choosing when to step in and when to step back. And that choice, repeated over time, becomes a habit. A quiet discipline that shapes everything you do. But discipline, real discipline, is not about forcing yourself constantly. It's not about pushing harder every day until you burn out. It's about consistency. Small actions repeated deliberately, choosing the pause again and again, questioning the thought again and again, returning to the present again and again. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No one applauds it. No one notices it immediately. But over time, it builds something solid inside you, a kind of stability that doesn't depend on motivation. Because motivation comes and goes. Some days you feel focused. Other days you don't. Some moments feel easy. Others feel heavy. If you rely on those fluctuations, your progress will always be inconsistent. But when you rely on discipline, even in small ways, something changes. You continue, even when it's uncomfortable. You stay steady, even when it would be easier to react. And slowly, that steadiness becomes part of who you are. It's no longer something you try to do. It's something you naturally return to. And as you continue building this, you begin to notice something else. Silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of unnecessary noise inside your mind. The constant reactions begin to fade. The urge to respond to everything begins to weaken. The need to prove something to everyone begins to disappear. And in that silence, clarity appears. You see situations more simply. You understand people more easily. You make decisions without overcomplicating them. Because your mind is no longer crowded with every passing thought. It has space, and that space allows you to think clearly, to act deliberately, to remain grounded, even when things around you are not. But this doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easy. There will still be difficult moments, situations that test you, people who challenge your patience, outcomes that don't go your way. The difference is how you meet them. Instead of being pulled in immediately, you pause. Instead of assuming the worst, you question it. Instead of reacting emotionally, you choose your response. And sometimes that response is still imperfect. You might still react. You might still get frustrated. You might still feel overwhelmed. But now, you notice it sooner. You correct it faster. You don't stay stuck in it. And that is progress. Not perfection, but awareness. Not control over everything, but control over how you respond. And over time, that becomes enough. Because when you can manage your response, you can navigate almost anything. You don't need the world to be predictable. You don't need people to behave perfectly. You don't need circumstances to always go your way. You only need one thing: clarity. The ability to see what is happening without immediately distorting it. The ability to recognize your thoughts without automatically believing them. The ability to feel emotions without being controlled by them. And when you have that, something settles inside you. A quiet confidence, not the kind that needs to prove itself, but the kind that doesn't get shaken easily. You begin to trust yourself. Not because you expect everything to go perfectly, but because you know you can handle whatever happens. And that trust changes how you move through life. You become less hesitant, less reactive, less dependent on external conditions. You act because it aligns with your values, not because you're chasing approval or avoiding discomfort. And slowly, almost without realizing it, you become someone who is not easily disturbed, not because nothing affects you, but because you understand how to process what does. And that understanding creates freedom. Freedom from constant reaction. Freedom from unnecessary tension. Freedom from the need to control everything outside you, because you've learned to manage what is within. And once you experience that even briefly, you start to see everything differently. The same situations appear, but they don't feel the same. The same challenges arise, but they don't overwhelm you the same way, because you are no longer meeting them with the same mindset. You are meeting them with awareness. And awareness changes everything. It slows you down just enough to see clearly. It creates just enough distance to choose wisely. It gives you just enough control to remain steady. And that steadiness becomes your foundation. Not something fragile, not something temporary, but something you can return to again and again. Even when you lose it for a moment. Even when you forget, because you will forget sometimes. You will get caught in old patterns. You will react without thinking. You will feel pulled by emotions again. That doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're human. What matters is how quickly you return, how soon you remember, how willing you are to step back into that space again. And each time you do, it becomes easier. Each time you notice, it becomes faster. Each time you choose awareness, it becomes more natural. Until one day, what once felt like effort starts to feel like your default. You pause without forcing it. You question without struggle. You remain steady without trying so hard. And at that point, something important becomes clear. You were never trying to control life. You were learning to understand yourself. And that understanding was the key all along. Because life will always be unpredictable. People will always be different. Situations will always change, but if you remain grounded within yourself, none of that has the same power over you. You move through it instead of being moved by it. You respond instead of reacting. You choose instead of being pulled. And in that, you find something most people spend their entire lives searching for. Not perfection, not constant happiness, but stability, a steady mind in an unsteady world. And from that place, everything you do becomes more intentional, more aligned, more real, because it is no longer driven by impulse. It is guided by awareness. And that is where true control lives, not in what happens next, but in how you meet it when it does. And even as that steadiness begins to take root, life will continue to test it in ways you don't expect. Not always through big dramatic moments, but through small, ordinary situations that seem almost insignificant at first. A delay that disrupts your plans. A conversation that doesn't go the way you imagined. A moment where things feel slightly off, slightly uncomfortable. These are the moments where your awareness is either strengthened or forgotten, because it's easy to remain calm when everything is going well. It's easy to feel in control when nothing is challenging you. But your real progress shows up in the moments that don't cooperate. When something irritates you and you still choose to pause. When something disappoints you and you still choose to see clearly. When something provokes you and you still choose not to react immediately. That is where your practice becomes real. And at first, it won't be perfect. There will be times when the reaction comes too quickly. Times when you realize it only after it has already happened. Times when the emotion feels too strong to observe. But even then, something has changed, because now you notice. And noticing is the beginning of correction. Instead of staying stuck in that reaction, you step back, you reflect. You understand what happened, not to judge yourself, but to learn from it. You begin to see the patterns more clearly. What triggers you, what pulls your attention, what weakens your awareness. And once you see those patterns, you are no longer completely controlled by them. You start to anticipate them. You prepare for them. Not in a tense or defensive way, but in a calm, observant way. You know that certain situations will test you, so when they appear, you are ready. You recognize the early signs, the shift in your thoughts, the change in your tone, the tightening of your body. And instead of being carried away by it, you meet it with awareness. You slow down, you breathe, you return to that space, and in doing so, you interrupt the pattern. That interruption, even if it's brief, weakens the habit that used to control you. And the more often you interrupt it, the less power it has over time. This is how real change happens, not through sudden transformation, but through repeated awareness. Small moments where you choose differently. Moments that seem insignificant on their own, but together they reshape how you think, how you feel, and how you respond. And as this continues, your relationship with difficulty begins to shift. You stop seeing challenges as something to avoid. You start seeing them as something that reveals you. Each difficult moment becomes a mirror. It shows you where your awareness is strong and where it still needs attention. And instead of resisting that, you use it. You allow those moments to refine you, to strengthen your ability to stay grounded, to deepen your understanding of yourself. And slowly, difficulty stops feeling like an interruption. It becomes part of the process, something that contributes to your growth instead of taking away from it. At the same time, you begin to notice how much energy you used to waste. Energy spent on overthinking, on replaying conversations, on imagining outcomes that never happened, on holding on to things that didn't matter as much as they felt in the moment. That energy, once scattered, begins to return to you because you are no longer giving it away so easily. You are more selective, more intentional. You choose where your attention goes, and attention, over time, shapes your experience. Where you place it determines what grows. If you constantly focus on what is wrong, your mind will find more of it. If you focus on what you can control, your mind begins to organize itself around action instead of reaction. And that shift changes how you experience even the same situations. You become less distracted by what you can't change, more engaged with what you can, and that clarity makes your actions more effective. You waste less time hesitating, less time doubting, less time being pulled in different directions. Because your mind is not constantly divided, it is focused, and that focus creates momentum. You start finishing what you begin. You follow through more consistently. You build trust with yourself, not through promises, but through action. And that trust becomes one of the most important things you develop. Because when you trust yourself, you stop second-guessing every decision. You stop relying on external validation. You stop needing constant reassurance. You move forward with quiet confidence. Not because you are certain of every outcome, but because you are certain of your ability to respond. And that certainty allows you to take on more, to handle more responsibility, to face more uncertainty without being overwhelmed by it. But as you grow stronger in this way, something else becomes important. Balance, because it's easy to misunderstand this process, to think that being steady means becoming emotionless, to believe that control means suppression. But that's not what this is. You are not trying to remove emotion. You are learning how to experience it without being ruled by it. You still feel, you still care, you still experience joy, frustration, excitement, disappointment. The difference is that those emotions no longer decide your actions for you. They inform you, but they don't control you. And that allows you to stay connected without becoming overwhelmed. You can care deeply without losing yourself. You can engage fully without being consumed. You can experience life without being carried away by every wave. That balance is what keeps your stability from becoming rigidity. It keeps you flexible, responsive, alive to what is happening, but not lost in it. And as you continue to move forward with this awareness, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Your presence changes, not in a way that you announce, but in a way that others can feel. You become someone who is calm in situations where others are reactive. Someone who listens instead of immediately responding. Someone who doesn't add unnecessary tension to already difficult moments. And that presence has an effect. People may not always understand it, but they notice it. Because stability stands out in a world that is often restless. And without trying to influence others, you begin to. Not through words, but through how you carry yourself. Through how you respond. Through how you respond. Through how you remain steady when it would be easier not to. And that influence creates something meaningful. Because it doesn't just change you, it changes the environments you move through. You become someone who brings clarity into confusion, calm into tension, perspective into situations that feel overwhelming, and that is not something that happens overnight. It is built slowly, through all the moments where you chose awareness instead of reaction, through all the times you returned to yourself instead of getting lost in everything around you. And even then, the process continues, because there is no final point where you are completely unaffected. There is no moment where you never react again. There is only a deeper and deeper understanding, a stronger and stronger awareness, a more consistent return to that space within you. And that is enough, because the goal was never perfection, it was freedom. Freedom from being controlled by every external event. Freedom from being pulled by every internal impulse. Freedom to choose how you think, how you feel, how you respond. And as that freedom becomes more natural, life begins to feel different. Not easier, but clearer. Not quieter, but more manageable. Because you are no longer fighting everything. You are working with what is in front of you. You are responding to reality instead of reacting to interpretation. You are present, and in that presence there is a kind of calm that doesn't depend on anything outside you, a calm that stays even when things are uncertain, a calm that remains even when things don't go your way, a calm that you can return to again and again, and that calm becomes your foundation, something steady, something reliable, something that carries you through whatever comes next, because no matter what changes around you, that space within you remains. And now you know how to find it.